Right, welcome back. As some of you may know, I was shooting with a 5D Mark II for quite a long period of time, and shortly after I made the video about how I was been using the 5D Mark II for a long time, it died on me. I think it got close to about 500,000 shutter activations and it died. So I was left in a situation where I didn't really know what to do with cameras, and people that are on YouTube, and I've at this stage only got a small channel, but I think on YouTube there's a lot of pressure to have the latest and greatest, and I think that that's filtered down into the photography community in general. I have to tell you though, I am interested always in new cameras and the latest gear that's coming out. I do keep a loose eye on it, let's say that. I look at it a little bit, but I'm much more into planning photo shoots and trips to go places to take photos than I am actually in the camera gear that I'm using. Although I'm interested to a point, it's not like a major interest of mine. I'm always, with photographers, I like talking about gear, but I really like talking about planning where to go and what they're doing and finding out more about things like that. And there is a lot of pressure, I think, on photographers in order for them to keep up with all the latest gear and the latest lenses and so on. And I get that, and I know there's a desire to do it, but I think we need to be careful that doesn't outdo the desire to actually take photos. Yeah, because there's a lot of people that just own the gear and don't really take that many photos, but there's also people that buy expensive gear and take amazing photos with it. So you get across the board like a whole different range of opinions and so on with it. Now for me, I was trying to think, like, what am I going to do? Because the cameras that I own at that stage to take photos with that I could realistically use for photography was a 5D Mark I, a D600 from Nikon, and a Sony A7 original model that I was given. Now, I went through a quick process on this of eliminating, actually it wasn't quick, it took a bit longer than I thought, because I was debating, should I buy a top of the range new camera or should I just try and make do with what I've got? And the Mark I kind of ruled out because I didn't have many reliable batteries for it. I could buy another one, but it is something of a slightly limited camera without the live view, and I like the live view for composition, just to be able to get the composition. I not rule it out completely. You know, I'm going to use that camera sometimes. It's just, I really love the 5D Mark I, and it's a super capable camera. It's just I'm comparing it to the other ones that I've got. And then I looked at the Sony A7 and I started using it, and I thought that was fantastic. But the real problem I had with the Sony A7 was down to the battery life, and that wouldn't necessarily be a problem for most people, but in the country that I live in and the time I take photos, it's often cold, which reduces battery life even further. And I tend to go on 3 or 4 day trips, and then you have to think about a charging routine and extra power banks, and it could be done. But in the end, I decided to go for my D600, my Nikon D600 for landscape photography. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about the D600 in case it's a camera that you're considering. For me, the D600, although you probably wouldn't see me shoot much with it on my YouTube channels, it's the camera in my lifetime that I've used more than any. And this is my first one. I've owned 4 of these, and this is the first one that I ever bought, and it's quite battered and scratched up now. And the reason it's like that is because I bought this camera for wedding photography, and whilst I've owned other cameras for wedding photography in the meantime, I've had Nikon D3S, I've had the D810, D750, I've always kept coming back to the D600. It's been a backup camera at times, and for a long time it's been primary cameras, and I said I've had 4 of them over the years, and this is the first one I ever bought, and I've kept this one. And in the end I kept it for nostalgia, because as I sort of came to the point where I was moving on from it, I decided that this camera of mine has really been through the wars, and I've taken more photos on this specific D600 than any other camera that I've ever owned. And whilst it's definitely an entry level DSLR, like a full frame DSLR, it has a lot of the features that you'd find in bigger more expensive camera models. And that for me really made it an attractive purchase, and it's just done so well. And I thought that the files that came from the D600 looks really nice, and I like them. And I guess over time I've just kept coming back to this camera. Now, I'll talk to you. I've done a video about my wedding settings for this camera, and I'll put a link to that up here for you. But I'll talk to you a little bit about this and why I think it's a potentially good option for landscape photographers, and some of the downsides, because there are a couple of downsides with this. And the lens that I'm choosing to use with it is the 16 to 35, and I'll just briefly mention why I'm using that first instead of the 14 to 24. And it's because of the zoom range. It's not to do with filters or, you know, the ability to screw filters on, or even the weight of it, although that's a small consideration for me. It's actually just the zoom range. I find that I'm often wanting to be in the 24 to 30, or the 20mm to 30mm range. And the 14 to 24 would mean that I'd have to bring another lens and change over to it. That's as simple as that, really. That's why I chose it. It's a good lens. There's nothing wrong with it. I think it's a decent lens. It's nice to use, but it was just that extra zoom range. I value that range in the 20 to 35mm, or more specifically, I suppose, the 20 to 30mm range, more than I do the extra 2mm on the wide end. But you should be under no illusions, the 2mm on the wide end do make a big difference. As you get wider with a lens, the difference is more noticeable. For instance, if you go from 70mm to 72, that's barely noticeable, but from 14 to 16 is definitely noticeable. However, for me, 16 or even 17 or even 18mm is enough. It's wide enough for me. That's okay. And if I want to go wider, I could sort of do a small panorama, you know, maybe 3 photos, or you know, just like 3 photos together. I could panorama to go a little bit wider if I want to. Now, getting on to the D600 itself, there's 2 things about it that I would say. Let me start on the negatives, because that could put people off, but please don't just say, oh, that's a deal breaker for me, because some of it really shouldn't be. Okay, so the first thing is that there's a reputation for this camera to have oil spots on the sensor, and Nikon has become one of those companies now that I think has it's bizarrely gone off the radar. Where it was such a big player, it's now seen as like a sort of a weak 3rd or 4th place camera company. But actually Nikon has an enormous user base, and Nikon has this sort of way of dealing with problems, which, unless you were doing photography in the time when Nikon was much more dominant in the market than it is now, you probably wouldn't really know about it. So Nikon has this thing where they don't really admit to problems. And the way they deal with problems is they make changes to cameras and don't talk about it. So when the dust spot issue came out on the launch, it was a really big deal, and they then made the D610, which was supposed to be the one that fixed that problem, which I think it did. But my guess from it, having owned 4 D600s, which were not like the first weren't the first run of the camera. These were probably from like after the first year. I haven't had any oil problems with them, and I think that that's probably because they were already fixing the issue. That's kind of how I think Nikon operates. They kind of fix things, and then they know that it's hurting sales, so they have to rebrand that to a D610, so people can then know that what they're buying is the fixed version of that camera system, so it makes a definitive break for the purchasers. But I think what happened with Nikon is that they were fixing the problem anyway. That's kind of how they operate in my experience. It's kind of been like that. So I haven't had any problem with the oil spots on the sensor with the D600s that I've owned. Now, and I think from what I heard, that once you get to about 10,000 actuations on the shutter, that the problem starts to disappear, and if you have it clean, then it's okay. I know that doesn't sound great, but a D610, if you want to be safe, would cover those issues, or buy a used one from somewhere where you can return it if it's got the oil problem, and you'll know it straight away, because you can see, just do a photo of a plain wall at sort of f8 or something, and you'll see it on the pictures that come up. Now, the other negative with the camera, which is for me actually a minor one, you'll think that this is a big negative, but it isn't. is that the live view on it doesn't have an exposure preview. So what I mean by that is that when you press the live view button on the screen, it doesn't show you the exposure that you're going to get. It just shows you the composition. Now, this is like positive and negative, but the positive side of this is if you're doing something which I do a lot, which is exposed for the highlights, you're ending up with an exposure that can be quite dark at times, and that can make it hard to see your composition. So whilst you need to take 1 or 2 test shots to get the exposure right, when you're actually then doing your composition and want to change and do different compositions, it kind of negates that problem, because it becomes a bit of a benefit that you can actually see the picture in front of you clearly. So what you'll get is a sort of an auto exposure preview of the scene, and that won't be what you're actually taking. You'll have to take a photograph in order to actually see it. But like I said, I never found that to be a problem for me. It would be nice if it could do the live view preview. For landscapes, it doesn't matter, because it takes some seconds to take your test shot. It's not like you're trying an entire range of different exposures to see what works. It's 2 or 3 shots and you're there. Yeah, and I don't find that to be a problem, and I've never found it to be a problem when I was shooting weddings with it either. I think once you get to know a camera, you can guess really close to what the exposure is anyway, and then just make a couple of adjustments afterwards. I can usually take one photo, and then the next one is the correct exposure, or maybe one after that, and then that's it. But then if you want to do different shots and stuff, you're making no adjustments, or just really small incremental adjustments to it, but you can see the scene properly. So actually, I think it's becoming perhaps my preferred way to work for landscapes, is to have the exposure preview turned off. So for me, it hasn't really made a great deal of difference. I think that that's going to be okay. Now, if you're still with me on this and you're still listening, the thing about this is there are a lot of upsides to this camera, and I can talk with true experience on this one, because I've shot so much stuff with the D600. I really know this camera really, really well. So let's go through some of the benefits of this one. As I said before, the colours on it are really good and the files are really nice. It has excellent dynamic range. The low light performance is reasonable, but we're talking about shooting stuff that's on tripods when it comes to landscapes. But I think it makes a really good wedding and portrait camera as well. I've found, even though the autofocus system on it is, I think, from the D7000, one of the crop sensor cameras, my experience of it, let's say compared to the 5D Mark III, I'm afraid to say it, the D600 has performed better. Now, whilst it might not be quite as fast in broad daylight, I found it better in low light, and in really low light, I found it to be significantly better. That's been my experience with a variety of different lenses on both systems, that the D600 in some instances was smoking the 5D Mark III in low light. I found the 5D Mark III very unreliable in comparison to it. But in good light, the 5D Mark III would be a bit quicker. But it's not been a problem for me. I found it to be pretty decent, and in fact I would actually say I quite rate the focus system on this, even though it's not Nikon's best. Nikon has always been very, very good at autofocus, and so a system that's kind of like average for Nikon is actually really good compared to a lot of other camera manufacturers. Another thing is the robustness. Now you can check about like where the different plates on this camera are, but you know, like where the metal plates are and what's plastic and so on. But I'll tell you, this thing has been through the wars. It's been dropped so many times on concrete and so on, and it is still chugging along with no issues whatsoever. I mean, it's dented, it's scratched all over to pieces, it's been scraped along things. That's just what happens over years when you're shooting weddings. They end up like that, but it's still kept going. I think they're a tough little camera, regardless of what materials are used here or there. It's stood up to some serious abuse, and I don't think it could be treated much worse than it's been treated, but it's put up with it. The other thing is dual card slots, which is nice to have. I think every camera should have it. It's got it. It's just, you know, nice to have. The SD cards as well, both of them. I think that's a bonus because people have lots of SD cards. They're small, they're easy to use, they're easy to get if you need another one. It's nice to have. I think that's a good thing to have. Battery life. Battery life goes on and on and on. I'm telling you, the battery life is insane. Like I think because this is a lower powered camera compared to some of the other ones, the Nikon battery that's in it, I mean, I would shoot weddings and have one as my main camera and the other one as a backup, and I'd use half a battery for a whole day, maybe 2/3, and that would be the entire day at a wedding. It just goes on and on and on. Really, really good. And they're also very good in resistance to the cold and so on. So that's been a real bonus, and to the point where if I use this camera on a landscape photography shoot, these little batteries here, they really last. So in terms of going for a 4-day landscape photography trip, I'll take one battery, nothing else. I don't need more than that because I know it's going to last. And that's really saying something, that the battery will last that long, that I don't need to take a spare. I just don't need it. I mean, I know people would say, well, you should just take one as a backup. There's really no need. I don't need it. I can do a 4-day trip with loads of photography on that and come back and it's still half full. It will just go on and on and on. And that makes a difference. Now, it's not a particularly lightweight camera. It's not a particularly heavy camera. I think it's kind of average in weight. But when you start adding on batteries to camera systems and chargers and more power banks and so on, if you need them, the weights can go up much faster than you think. So that definitely really helps. The other thing that I like on these cameras, and I know it's sort of seen as a beginner thing, these dials, yeah, they're great. I think they're great because you can just at a glance see which mode you're in. It's really easy to change. You've got two customizable modes, U1 and U2, which is like the modes that you'd have on a Canon camera as well, where you can preset them to different things. I think that it's very good for that. I like on the Nikon cameras that the on-off switch is just a quick flick like this as well, and the camera does everything that you'd need a landscape photography camera to do. The only thing for me that I would like to have, which it doesn't have, is a tilt screen. That would definitely improve the usability. I think tilt screens are really good, but the D600 or D610 are very cheap cameras used now. You might look and say, well, the D800 is a few hundred more. Should I get the D800? Well, it's up to you. Maybe D800 is a really good camera as well. I'd say a D800 is a more refined version of the D600. But the D600, as I said, it's done really, really well for me, and I haven't had any problems with it so far. And in terms of the setup for it, it really is just going to be this. It's just the D600 with a 16-35. That is it. That's all I'm taking. Yeah, I've always been a photographer that didn't have a ton of lenses. I get more pleasure out of working with one lens than I do with having a whole load of them on me. Now for me, I'm using this camera because I own it. And it was on, I kept it for sentimental reasons really. And it's been on the shelf for a while now. And I've kind of just brought it out of retirement for my landscape photos. So from now on, that's going to be the camera that you see me using when I get back to doing some landscape photography. And I would say to you that look at the prices online of these as used cameras. They're surprisingly cheap, and they're very, very good cameras, especially for the money. They're really good. I don't think you'd go wrong with it. I think you'd end up having quite a good time with it. If you want to see more of my landscape photography, especially the photos I'm going to be taking with this camera, please subscribe to my channel and you'll get to come along with me virtually, I suppose, on my landscape photography trips. I've got a lot of stuff planned over the winter, so I'm going to be getting going again soon. You'll get a chance to catch all of those videos and go off to different places. And if you found this useful, please like and feel free to leave a comment if you want to say anything as well, and I'll try and get back to you too.